tonight's speaker, Vanessa May, who is an associate professor of history and co-director of the Women and Gender Studies program at Seton Hall University. She received her bachelor's degree from Vassar, her MA and PhD from the University of Virginia. And one thing that's important to understand is that this is Vanessa's third appearance in our series. We don't invite her back just because of her sparkling personality. We invite her back because of her skills as a presenter. And so, Vanessa, who incidentally has published a book, Understanding Labor, Household Workers, Politics, and the Middle Class Reform in New York from 1870 to 1940, a number of scholarly articles, including Standardizing the Home, Women Reformers, and Domestic Service, and A New Deal Gone Bad. So, once again, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Vanessa back, and please give her a Camden County College Center welcome.
So thank you. I was looking at the center brochure and I realized that I had not put 1968 in the title, so I want to assure you that this will be about 1968. Today I want to talk about the 1968 Miss America protest that kicked off the women's movement. And I have to say that as I was writing this lecture, I was sort of thinking about what's going on today. And so at the end, I sort of do want to try to draw some connections between the kinds of women's activism that we're seeing out in the world today and the kinds of women's activism that kicked off on the boardwalk in Atlantic City in 1968. And I think this protest is really important for a bunch of reasons. It was the moment of national recognition for the women's liberation movement that had started brewing in the early 1960s and 70s. It moved activist groups who had been working in relative obscurity in the 1960s into the national spotlight. Media coverage promoted the protests across the country and made the movement a national concern. It's also important because it marked a new departure for women's activism in the United States. The Miss America protest in 1968 ushered in a new kind of protest, focused not just on political and legal equality, but on revolutionizing gender relations that were the foundation of society. And this new kind of feminism required a new kind of theorizing on the part of feminists. A new way of thinking about gender inequality and where it came from and what counts as a women's issue and what women's politics should look like. New ways of organizing, which I think we could argue are still with us in a lot of ways today. So let's start with Miss America. So the Miss America pageant was established in 1921 and it had been held yearly since that date, but 1968 was going to be different. It was held in Atlantic City that year. And I'm going to start here. It was held in Atlantic City that year. And on September 7th, women's liberationists started to gather in Atlantic City. They had boarded buses out of New York, out of Boston, out of Washington, D.C., Detroit, Florida, and, of course, New Jersey. One of the groups had purchased, a few members of the group had purchased 16 tickets to the actual pageant, and they went in. Although they tried, they said, to disguise themselves, quote, with straight clothes and lots of makeup. Security guards suspected that they were demonstrators when they tried to slip into the pageant. So as the outgoing Miss America stood up on stage to read her speech out loud, several women activists stood up. They unfurled a flag. It read Women's Liberation. And they chanted some slogans. Freedom for women. No more Miss America. Television audiences knew that something was happening because they could see that people in the auditorium were distracted. They heard some shouting. They heard the outgoing Miss America's voice start to tremble a little bit. They heard her stutter. But they didn't get the full message of the protest on national TV because the NBC producer had directed the cameramen not to film the protest. And so they didn't find out what had happened until the morning papers arrived on their doorstep the next day. The police quickly arrested the protesters and dragged them out of the auditorium. They who were still yelling their slogans on the way out. But outside on the boardwalk is where the real action went down. About 200 women picketed the contest. Guerrilla theater took place all over the sidewalks. Some of the women changed themselves to a life-size Miss America puppet, which is what's pictured here. You can see the young woman beside her with the chain around her neck. The idea here was to protest women's enslavement to beauty standards. Peggy Dobbins dressed up as an auctioneer, and she stood next to this puppet. She read from a script that said, "Step right up. How much am I offered for this #1 piece of prime American property?" She sings in the kitchen, hums at the typewriter, purrs in bed, unquote. And I want to sort of point out here that humor was a central aspect of this protest. I think feminists have gotten a bad rap for not being funny, for being seriously unfunny, but actually feminists are hilarious. And I have proof. Let's see if I can go back, because I think I can. Right? So here are the Miss America pageant that they staged out in the boardwalk, in which they brought several sheep. I don't know how they got the sheep on the bus, but they brought several sheep to the protest. They crowned one of them Miss America. They paraded the sheep in their little sash and crown around on the boardwalk, and they explained that this was an effort to, quote, parody the way the contestants, who are all women, are appraised and judged like animals at a county fair, unquote. They also, and I want to tell you this because this is sort of the moment that all feminists had been known for afterwards. They brought out a large freedom trash can, which you can see there, in which they threw what they called instruments of torture, which included girdles. I think we can all agree that girdles are torturous. False eyelashes, curlers, makeup, wigs, high-heeled shoes, copies of both Playboy and the Ladies' Home Journal. So they threw all of those things into the freedom trash can. They also threw some bras into the freedom trash can. And the plan had been to light the trash can on fire. But ultimately, the Atlantic City Police, when they had gotten the permits, had asked them not to light it on fire because it was a wooden boardwalk that was historic and they didn't want to burn it down. And so these very radical feminists abided by fire codes and did not light the trash can on fire. And so the one thing that, if you don't already know this, I do want you to know, is that not a single bra was burned in the Miss America protest of 1968. Of course, the media immediately called them bra burners, and they were known as bra burners in every protest that women prosecuted over the next 10 years. But in fact, no bras were hurt in the prosecution of the Miss America protest. Later, the feminist Carol Hanish, who's famous for her manifesto called The Personalist Political, she was also important in developing consciousness raising, which I'll talk about in a minute. But she said, quote, "The media picked up on the bra part. I often say that if they had called us girdle burners, every woman in America would have run to join us," unquote. So in an attempt to encourage newspapers to hire more women reporters, and especially to allow women to report hard news, because in the 1960s, women reporters were confined to the society pages, or they were confined to what was called the women's page in the newspapers. The protesters refused to speak to any male reporters and insisted they would only speak to women reporters. By the time they went home, the sensation of Atlantic City had reached a mass audience, and they had put the women's liberation movement on the map. So I just want to contextualize this protest a little bit. That's the story of the protest, but who were these women? What was the larger context for this protest? And I just want to see if I'll stop at Robin Morgan. I want to sort of point out here that two of the recentish surveys of women's liberation are one's called Tidal Wave, and one's called The World Split Open. And I think that the titles of those demonstrate the extent to which the women's liberation movement ushered in a sea change in American life. In the 1950s and early 1960s, job ads were listed by sex so that women couldn't apply for men's jobs. And of course, those men's jobs usually carried a higher pay, opportunities for promotion, and so forth. Until 1963, it was perfectly legal to pay women 2/3 of men's salary for doing exactly the same job. You could fire women who got married or became pregnant. Women couldn't get credit in their own name, which makes it really hard to buy a house or a car if you need a man to co-sign your loan. And in fact, my advisor in graduate school talks about in her first job, there was a woman in the department who wanted to buy a house, and she had to get the chair of the department to co-sign her home mortgage because she couldn't get credit in her own name. Domestic violence was seen as distasteful but not necessarily criminalized. Police usually looked the other way and considered it a private matter. Marital rape was not a crime. And in fact, when feminists argued that it should be a crime, Bob Wilson, who was the chair of the Judiciary Committee of the California Senate, said, quote, "If you can't rape your wife, then who can you rape," unquote. So in New York, rape victims needed 2 witnesses in order to prove, to be considered credible in court. And it's, obviously very difficult to provide 2 witnesses to rape. Professional and graduate schools regularly imposed quotas of 5 to 10% on the numbers of the amount of the class that they would admit as women. So only 5% of the class or 10% of the class would be women. They were saving those places for men. It was assumed women would get married and would leave school, or they would leave their profession, and so an education was wasted on them. There was a widespread cultural assumption that women were naturally docile, passive, domestic, and subordinate. Office wives, i.e. the secretary, was expected to make coffee for the whole office and to buy birthday presents for the boss's wife. Men, it was assumed, would not tolerate having a female boss. There were jobs, which were lawyers and surgeons, that it was assumed that women just couldn't do. So that was the world in which these young women were born into. Peggy Dobbins, who was one of the organizers of the Miss America protest, remembered not being allowed to jump off the high diving board when her brother was allowed to do so. She also remembered being one of 2 girls in her high school physics class, and that she started the year off getting A's, and then her grades mysteriously started to get lower and lower and lower. And she knew she had the right answers on the tests and in class, and she couldn't understand. And then her physics teacher told her that if she got high grades and went to college, that she'd be, quote, depriving the world of an engineer, because men were engineers, and she would be taking a man's place in a university. Carol Hanish remembered being required to wear skirts to college while men wore pants. She also remembered that it would be very easy to be fired for inappropriate dress if you didn't live up to certain beauty standards, which might include wearing makeup, a girdle, curled hair, sometimes false eyelashes. So as one of the organizers said, quote, "Every day in a woman's life is a walking Miss America contest," unquote. And so some of these things, not being able to jump off the diving board seems small, but I think one of the things that radical feminists did was they connected the small things to the big things, right? And argued that this isn't about, a few laws. This is about the sort of whole culture that put women in particular positions. And of course, the women who protested in the Miss America pageant in 1968 were not the first women to notice inequality between men and women. Other groups of women, like, for instance, NOW, which was established in 1963 with Betty Friedan as the president, had already been working by 1968 to ameliorate some of the worst aspects of legal inequality. So when I talk about NOW, I'm going to sort of broadly, and I'm probably generalizing, but we're going to talk about now as liberal feminists. And the young women who protested in Atlantic City saw themselves as very different from that group. First of all, liberal feminists like Betty Friedan were primarily interested in political change. They wanted to integrate women into public roles in society. In other words, they wanted women to have an equal part in the world as it already existed. So they didn't question cultural gender stereotypes. Many did not question women's primary responsibility to care for children or other domestic roles until much later, when radical feminists had sort of introduced this new sort of theory of gender equality. So they tended to lobby for things like equal pay or the Equal Rights Amendment. And they weren't as interested in questioning how culture affected gender. The radical feminists who protested in Atlantic City, on the other hand, wanted to upend the entire gender system. As far as they were concerned, they were revolutionaries. They believed that women's oppression began in the family, in the most private aspects of women's lives, and that you had to change those private aspects if you ever wanted to have a chance to have true political change. They organized under Carol Hanish's slogan, "The personal is political." And so rather than focusing on legal inequality between men and women, they were interested in focusing on women's shared experience in the culture. They wanted to revolutionize society. They questioned the most basic assumptions that people took as common sense in the 1960s. They suggested for the first time that power relations structured daily life, that power relations were present in the bedroom, in the nursery, in marriages, at work. Because they were so interested in changing culture and the gendered assumptions that underlay society, rather than just focusing on political lobbying, one of their central organizing techniques was called consciousness raising. And that made them very different from liberal feminists who were visiting senators' offices and campaigning in local elections. Consciousness raising depended on the premise that once women got together and shared personal experiences, they would see that their problems were not, in fact, personal, but in fact, those were problems that were shared by all the women in the room, and that those were political problems and not personal problems. So in small groups and in larger meetings in church basements and people's rec rooms across the country, women began to meet and to talk about their lives, to explore questions that many of them had never thought about before. They asked why women were responsible for housework, why little boys were given trucks and little girls were given dolls, why women cleaned the toilet and men cut the grass. And in sharing these personal stories, they began to describe the moment when everything came together, when they finally understood the ways in which gender roles had shaped their lives, and they referred to it as a series of cliques. Right? It was the 70s, cliques. I kind of like that. So all sorts of women joined these consciousness-raising groups across the country. And although liberal feminist leaders like Betty Friedan basically thought consciousness-raising was a waste of time, Betty Friedan, she was very successful, but she was often pretty critical of people who she saw as rivals for public attention. And so she basically dismissed these young radical feminists as distracting from what the real movement should be, which was the Equal Rights Amendment, reproductive access, changes in the law. But actually, consciousness raising was a really effective organizing tool. It brought women into the movement who otherwise were not that interested in becoming politically involved. It reached into people's homes and related these big political questions to their own personal and private lives. Consciousness raising also proceeded on the basis of women's experience. So you didn't have to be a veteran activist in order to be a good consciousness raiser. The only prerequisite was that you were a woman and you were willing to talk about your problems with other women. Any woman could join a consciousness-raising group, and because you were talking about your own personal experience, you could talk with as much authority as any other woman in the room. Now, the women who ran now had often spent decades in public reform, and so by the time you could gain any kind of authority, and now you would have had to work for years and years. But consciousness raising was a method of organizing that brought women together in ways that now was unable to. And so it really probably reached more women than any other form of political activity. And you can see these ideas about gender roles and culture as the foundation of women's oppression and of the foundation of sexual inequality in the Miss America protest as well. So for example, this is Robin Morgan. Robin Morgan was one of the primary organizers. She did most of the organizing work for the Miss America protest. And she put out a press release to describe what they were protesting in advance. And so for radical feminists like Robin Morgan, the Miss America protest seemed to represent everything they were fighting against. It showed women as spectacle, as an object of male desire, as an artificial image that didn't really resemble any women that they knew. It seemed to encourage women to be judged on their attractiveness rather than on their ability to contribute to society. Specifically, so I'll tell you what they said in the press release. They protested the pageant that promoted, quote, what they called the degrading, mindless, boob girly symbol, which encouraged women to compete for male approval by adhering to these, quote, ludicrous beauty standards. And the pageant lent itself to the idea that women had to be, quote, young, juicy, malleable, and inoffensive, bland, and apolitical. And they objected to the idea that Miss America should represent the apotheosis of women's aspirations. So as Morgan put it, quote, in this reputedly democratic society where every little boy supposedly can grow up to be president, what can every little girl hope to grow up to be? Miss America, that's where it's at. Real power to control our lives is restricted to men, while women get patronizing pseudo-power. An ermine clock and a bunch of flowers. Men are judged by their actions, women by their appearance, unquote. So the problem, in Morgan's view, was not, as liberal feminists like Betty Friedan would have it, that the political system, that political parties weren't nominating enough women for elective office. Instead, Morgan and other radical feminists insisted that the problem was a culture that told young women that they should strive to be Miss America rather than Madam President. And there were other differences, too, between these liberal feminists and these radical feminists who are protesting in Atlantic City. Whereas liberal feminists tended to be older and had spent decades in reform, radical feminists tended to be young. Many of them had just graduated from college. Moreover, liberal feminists tended to be part of these organized reform groups like NOW that had central control structures. So they had, the national organization had a president, a vice president, a treasurer, and then there were state chapters that also had presidents, vice presidents, and treasurers. But radical feminists had often begun their activism, they'd been introduced to activism in the student movements of the New Left and the Civil Rights Movement. And so for them, they looked at activism from a grassroots perspective. So their groups very rarely had a power structure. The idea was that they were going to rule by consensus. They wanted it to be mass participation. They sought to give everybody an equal voice. And many of them formed groups, but they refused to pick any one person to be the leader of that group. And instead, they relied on a really diffuse power structure. And I think that also goes to the ways in which young people in this generation are trying to reimagine what democracy could look like, right? Is there such a thing as participatory democracy, which I'm sure, when you talked about the student movements and other moments, you've heard that term before, right? You can see that these women are also trying to reimagine what democracy looks like, and they're doing it from a gendered perspective. But one of the things they learned in their experiences as in the student movements, in the New Left, and in the civil rights movement, was how to organize an effective protest. So they hadn't just learned about participatory democracy, they had also learned important political and organizing skills. So before coming to Atlantic City, they had gotten permits from the mayor's office to stage the demonstration. They had chartered buses to Atlantic City. They had made a plan of attack. A lot of the flashy protest tactics that took place on the boardwalk, from the Freedom Trash Can to the parades of Miss America sheep, also demonstrated that these young women had come out of these sort of mass protest movements and were a little less connected to the older feminist generation who were controlling now. The idea was that these kinds of protests could be like a national consciousness raising, that their message would be carried across the country, that it would become dinner table conversation across the nation, and that women in places where there weren't consciousness raising groups would start to think about these issues for the first time. And this was not the only attention-grabbing protest that feminists did during this period. So I brought you a bunch of examples because this is my favorite part. I sort of cherry-picked my favorite parts of everything I talk about with the second wave feminism, and this is sort of part of it. My personal favorite is when Iris Rivera, who was a legal secretary, was fired from her job in Chicago. She'd been fired because she refused to make coffee for the whole office. She had been asked to do that, and she said, "I'm a highly skilled legal secretary, my job is not to make coffee," and they said, "You're fired." She said, "I don't drink coffee, it's not listed as one of my job duties, and ordering the secretaries to fix coffee is carrying the role of homemaker too far," unquote. So she's fired. Women Employed, which is a feminist labor organization, came to her side to help her. And they held a series of protests outside the law firm in which, as the lawyers were coming into the building, they handed them all bags of used coffee grounds, and on it was a little flyer that explained to them how to make their own coffee. And step 5 said, "Turn switch to on. This is the most difficult step, but with practice, even an attorney can master it." And eventually, Iris Rivera got her job back. And these antics used the media to call attention to the gender relations that people in Chicago had long taken for granted, where it seemed perfectly natural to ask women workers to do the things that women did at home, like fix coffee for the whole office. My other favorite action was the feminist action in New York, when all of these radical feminists snuck into every bodega in New York and glued the pages of Playboy magazine together. So that must have been kind of a shock if you were in there to buy a Playboy. And these protests, as I said, were using the media to carry their message, to accomplish consciousness raising on a mass scale. And on the one hand, this fascination with the women's liberation movement assured that the goal was easily accomplished because the media was fascinated. They could not turn away. They covered all of these protests. But on the other hand, women's liberationists just could not control the message of how it was covered by the media. So I want to sort of turn now to thinking about how the media covered this protest and covered similar protests. And I think I forgot to show you these, right? We were talking about organizing and organizing tactics. Here's a poster for the women's liberation movement protests in Atlantic City. And I just want to sort of point out here that this looks like a regular protest poster that you might just flip past in an archive. But if you read it carefully, you can see evidence, historical evidence, of real political skills, right? There are charter buses. That round trip is $7. It's going to leave on Saturday morning. It's asking people, can you take somebody else in your car? It gives you a phone number to call. It also has sort of a kind of flashy symbol on there, right? So it might catch your eye if it's on a street corner. And so again, this seems like a sort of fly by the seat of your pants kind of protest, but it is planned down to the tiniest sort of moments. This is also a picture found this picture. This is the New York radical women in the office planning the protest. So you can see they look pretty serious there, right? They're not burning their bras in the office. So on the one hand, the media's fascination with the women's liberation movement helped them to spread their message across the country. And certainly, as experienced activists who had come out of the New Left and the civil rights movement, they understood the importance of the media to accomplishing political change. Certainly, the civil rights movement, one of the arguments about why it's so successful is that it brings images of brutality to northern audiences who then help to demand change. But they were extremely wary about whether the way the media covered the story would drive women away from the movement. And so that's one of the reasons that Robin Morgan wrote a press release in advance in an effort to try to start to control the narrative a little bit. She invited reporters to Atlantic City to cover the protest, but once the reporters got to Atlantic City, the version of feminism that viewers and readers got was the media's version and not Robin Morgan's version of the protest. So for instance, the New York Times, and that's the article on the left. I don't know why it's not, I can see so you can't see the quotes, the side of it is cut off, but it says, Chide's grandmother, man is disturbed, is one of the quotes that's taken from that article. And the New York Times coverage generally portrayed the protesters as desperate for attention. Although they reported that the women refused to talk to men, they did not say why they refused to talk to men. So the political goal, which was to get women reporters covering hard news, was totally absent from the coverage of the story, and it was just that the feminists had just refused to talk to men. The reporters described demonstrators' clothes. They emphasized that they were observed by, quote, about 650 generally unsympathetic spectators. The reporter pointed out that 65 of the pickets who had come in from New York were driven by, quote, male bus drivers. And that fact isn't necessarily important to the story, but it sort of implied that women were more than happy to rely on men when it was convenient, and that their feminist convictions were maybe not as strong as they said that they were. Meanwhile, all of the charges about sexism in the United States were placed in quotation marks, suggesting that these were sort of hallucinations and not necessarily lived reality for many women. And this was sort of a piece of the way that the media covered the women's liberation movement during this period. So let me give you some more examples. Howard K. Smith, who is the anchorman at ABC News, he gave the following lead-in to a giant feminist march in New York City. There had been 500,000 women in the streets. It was the biggest mass demonstration in American history up until that point. And this is how he framed it. He said, quote, "3 things have been difficult to tame: the oceans, fools, and women. We may soon be able to tame the ocean, but fools and women will take a little longer," unquote. At the end of the segment, Smith quoted West Virginia Senator Jennings Randolph, who called feminists, quote, "a small band of braless bubbleheads," unquote. Over on CBS, if you're going to flip over, because of course there's only 3 networks during this period, right? Eric Severeid covered the story by noting that, quote, "no husband ever won an argument with a wife, and the secret of a happy marriage is for the man to repeat those 3 little words: I was wrong." And he then went on to dismiss women's liberation as, quote, "aroused minorities who are already well off by any comparative measurement." And he asserted that the plain truth is most American men are startled by the idea that women are generally oppressed, and they read with relief the Gallup poll that 2/3 of women don't think they're oppressed either, unquote. So feminism, he argued, had, quote, grown by simple contagion, thousands discovering that they are in pain, although they hadn't noticed it until they were told, unquote. So here you can see he compares women's liberation to contagion, a disease, that it's spreading across the country in this sort of noxious way. And indeed, the news media were fascinated by radical feminists. But in almost every case, they did make an effort to dismiss radical feminist claims and portray the movement in a negative light, as either silly or radical or dangerous. So for instance, Time magazine covered Women's Strike for Equality Day, which was a pro-ERA march in 1970, with the following joke, quote, get ready to laugh. These are the times that try men's souls, and they are likely to get much worse before they get better. And then they went on to quote Margaret Mead, who said, quote, women's liberation has to be terribly conscious about the danger of provoking men to kill women. You have quite literally driven them mad, unquote. So radical feminists in these instances were either sort of the butt of the joke of kind of bemused journalists, or a dangerous force who are threatening society, right? And you can see similarly here, right? It's clear that, and these are articles that are covering the Miss America protest. It was clear that women alone are impossible to deal with. Pretty young women saying terrible things like that, much laughter, much jeering, much confusion. And they were also widely depicted. The other major way that they dismissed the women's liberation movement was by depicting those women as ugly. So let me give you an example. This is a picture of Kate Millett. Kate Millett had written a runaway bestseller called Sexual Politics, in which she, for the very first time, suggested that the media's images of women were often degrading, which I think is not big news today, but at the time, she's the first person to say that. So Time magazine covers Millett, and I will talk about it, but first I just want to show you. So this is how she appears on the cover of Time magazine. Right? I mean, you can immediately see, right? This is a normal-looking human being, and this is how Kate Millett is covered on the cover of Time. And you can sort of imagine that the article follows suit. I mean, usually when I teach this in class, I ask my students to look at it and tell me what they see. And, you can see the pronounced bags under her eyes. You can see that she looks kind of masculine, right? She's in this sort of aggressive stance. She seems like she's wearing men's clothes. She's sort of broad, right? I mean, you can sort of imagine that the underlying article follows suit in this way. In the article, the Time reporter mentioned more than once that her hair was dirty. In another article in Time, they reported that her books made one feel, quote, the book was written by a female impersonator, unquote. And Millett was not the only person who was treated this way. Betty Friedan was constantly discussed in terms of her appearance. One New York Times magazine article went on and on about her as, quote, a vision of somebody's eccentric middle-aged aunt. Her hair, a swirl of cowlicks, her face deeply lined and with a double chin. Time magazine, they were apparently a bastion of feminist commentary during this period because they dubbed the politician and feminist Bella Asbug, bellicose Asbug, and they described her as a sumu liberal. She was big, so they called her a sumu liberal, and a lady wrestler. And then there was also the bra issue, which I think we need to come back to, right? You remember I told you they threw some bras into the Freedom trash can and no bras were injured. But newspapers continually asserted that the women had burned their bras, and they were very focused on this issue. And so you can see bra burners plan, and above the headline there, it's a symbolic bra burning. So a year after the protest, for example, Newsweek dubbed the Miss America protest as one in which 150 women, quote, gathered in front of Convention Hall and burned their brasiers, unquote. So this metaphor also worked to trivialize feminism, but it also titillated the audience because it brings to mind these ideas of young women, unleashing their breasts, right? And this seems similar. In some ways, it sort of resembles discussion of burning draft cards. But it also fit into the media frame that equated the women's movement with narcissism and exhibitionism. Women who threw away their bras, the media seemed to suggest, were unleashing sexuality in a way that was unseemly, laughable, politically inconsequential, but also kind of dangerous. And so I think it's clear that the media's activism, the media could be kind of dismissive of feminist activism, but it was also really important to feminist organizing. It was a powerful organizing tool. After the Miss America protest appeared in newspapers across the country, Carol Hanish remembered, quote, being deluged with letters, more than our small group could possibly answer, many passionately saying, I've been waiting all my life for something like this to come along, unquote. And it really did bring women into the movement. New York radical women before the Miss America protest had about 30 women in it. After the Miss America protest, there were 150. The group, in fact, split after the Miss America protest because there were so many women who had tried to join that they weren't able to have the kind of, if you're going to have participatory democracy, you can't have that many people there. Otherwise, the meeting is going to last for 6 years because if everybody has to agree, what are you going to do, right? So this growth was marked in other organizations as well. Throughout this period, NOW's membership also skyrocketed. In 1967, there were 1,200 members of NOW. By 1974, there were 48,000 members of NOW. There were 700 chapters in the United States and in 9 countries. By 1972, the women's liberation movement had really arrived because it had an anthem, I Am Woman, Helen Reddy's I Am Woman, right? It hit gold, it hit #1 on the charts, it won Reddy a Grammy. Meanwhile, in the direct aftermath of the protest, Pepsi Cola withdrew its sponsorship from the pageant. And so there was an immediate impact that was successful. So now I just want to sort of think about the women's liberation movement as a movement and what were the sort of limitations to the sort of early theorizing about gender oppression. Many of these young women in the radical feminist movement were putting together a theory and an organization essentially out of whole cloth. They had very few examples to draw on. Radical movements had largely been driven underground or dissipated entirely by McCarthyism in the 1940s and 1950s. So older generations of people with radical ideologies were silent or gone by the 1960s. And indeed, one of the things that might draw an FBI inquiry if you were working in government was holding feminist sympathies. Meanwhile, women's history and the history of women's activism in the United States, so you might want to look to the great philosophers of women's history, people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or people like Mary Wollstonecraft, or people like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, or Sojourner Truth, right? But that was also unknown. So for instance, my other favorite story is the story of the FBI men who they had infiltrated all of these radical groups in the 1970s as part of COINTELPRO, and so they had infiltrated a women's liberation movement. And the reports that they sent back to the FBI said, listen, the women were talking a lot about this person called Susan B. Anthony, but she wasn't at the meeting. And so we think that she might be a communist who's on the run, right? But what that suggests, right, is that the sort of household knowledge of this sort of long tradition of women's activism and this long kind of theorizing about women's oppression and feminism was unknown to people in the 1960s, that nobody knew who Susan B. Anthony was. Women's history is a young field. It sort of emerges out of the women's movement in the 1970s. And so young radical feminists were sort of creating the movement's theory and creating the movement's organizing on their own. So after the protest, Carol Hanish published a critique of the Miss America protest in which she tried to do sort of a post-mortem of the protest to think about things that she wished had been different and ways of rethinking the protest. She criticized the shortcomings of the message. And you can see her in these writings, and I often assign manifestos to my, radical feminist manifestos to my students, and I think one of the problems, most of my students are between 18 and 22, and so they're just not hormonally ready, kind of, to think about patriarchy because they want to date men, you know, so it's hard to read all the, it's like, how do I navigate this? So, but I think one of the reasons I like to assign them is because you can see people thinking through all these issues in real time, where they're refining theories and refining their thinking and rethinking about how oppression works. And you can see Carol Hanish doing that after the Miss America protest. So for example, she argued that one of the shortcomings of the protest was that it seemed to be critiquing the contestants instead of the pageant and the larger culture that had led to the pageant. So she said, quote, "We didn't say clearly enough that we women are all forced to play the Miss America role, not by beautiful women, but by men who have to act that way by a system that has so well institutionalized male supremacy for its own end." Judith Duffett, who was also present at the protest, she said that our purpose was not to put down Miss America, but to attack the male chauvinism, commercialization of beauty, racism, and oppression of women symbolized by the pageant, unquote. And so here you can see these young radical feminists struggling with the most basic definitions of what is feminism. What is a woman's issue? Who is included in the feminist movement? What is the root of women's oppression? Is it men? Is it a system? Is it women who conform to the system? How do we work all of these things out? Another way in which the movement, I think, was just beginning to theorize was on issues of race. And it's also clear that the women who protested in the boardwalk in 1968 didn't totally ignore race. Many were deeply concerned with issues of racism. A lot of them had started their activism in the civil rights movement. They had traveled to the South during Freedom Summer and had done voter registration work. They also addressed race in their protests. So for instance, in her press release, Robin Morgan pointed out that the pageant had never had a black finalist, even though there had been test case contestants who had tried to enter the pageant. It had also never had a Puerto Rican finalist, Alaskan, Hawaiian, or Mexican-American winner. And Morgan said that the pageant therefore symbolized what she's called, quote, racism with roses. But here too, you can see the beginnings of the theory, but not the sort of well-developed ideas about intersections between race and gender that would emerge from the movement later on. The problem was not just about the lack of inclusion. The pageant also confirmed notions of beauty as being attached to whiteness. Black women and women of color were wholly excluded from ideas about beauty. So for black women, a Black Miss America pageant could be radical because it's challenging basic ideas about who is beautiful. And so I also want to sort of address this question because I think now there's a lot of discussion of second wave feminists as racist. And I think it is true that the majority of women who protested at Atlantic City were white. And they had not, as I said, they had not theorized the intersections between gender and race as clearly as they might have. And certainly, their main organizing technique was consciousness raising, which essentially theorized the personal experiences of the women present. So when most of the women who were there for the consciousness raising session were white, what that meant was that the theories tended to reflect the experience of white women. But I think it's also really important to understand the real concerns that underlay the Miss America protest in 1968. And also, I think, to dismiss the entire second wave feminist movement as racist ignores the women of color and black feminists who participated in second wave feminism. Today, we talk a lot about intersectionality, right? Which is a term that was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw in the 90s. And it is the idea that systems of power like racism and sexism are interlocked and that they are related to one another, right? And they intersect in ways that affect women who have multiple identities differently than white women, right? So black women experience the world differently than white women do. And so people use this word now as sort of the way the feminists now are different from women in the 1970s. But I would contend that this generation has invented the term intersectionality and popularized the term intersectionality, but it didn't invent the idea. Because ideas about overlapping identities are also clearly present, especially in, for instance, the Combahee River Collective, which is a group of black lesbian feminists who published a founding statement in 1978 in which they said, quote, "The most general statement of our politics at the time would be that we are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see our particular task the development of an integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that major systems of oppression are interlocking," unquote. Which sounds very similar to what Kimberly Crenshaw then says in the 1990s. So these ideas were present, just as black feminists were present in the 1970s. And I think we need to read all those documents as sort of an evolutionary process, right? And as black feminists critiqued the movement in the 1970s, it changed over time and expanded to reflect those other experiences. So now I kind of want to just talk about the ways in which these ideas are now sort of still being used, that there's still sort of a reliance on this kind of protest today. So I sort of pulled what I thought were the funniest signs from the Women's March in Washington, D.C. And I think certainly those huge women's marches, there was like 1 million people just in Washington, D.C., and there have been, repeatedly hundreds of thousands of women showing up every year to protest, owes a lot of its success, a lot of its germination to the women's liberation movement in the 1970s. Like Miss America protesters, they used flashy, attention-grabbing tactics. They used mass action to make their point. They filled the streets of Washington, D.C. in a well-coordinated and well-organized collective protest. I live in a town that is 4 square miles, and 39 buses from my town went to Washington, D.C. the day after the inauguration. They also used guerrilla theater. I could have showed you pictures of women dressed up in 1920s feminist outfits. They spent hours on their hilarious signs. The organizers of the Miss America protest continue to see these connections. So Carol Hanish worries that feminism today, quote, is too focused on glass ceilings and the individual getting ahead in a corrupt and unequal system, rather than on changing the structure to make life better for all women. Peggy Dobbins argues that the Me Too movement is the best sort of mass picking up the baton from what I thought and hoped we were doing at the time of the Miss America protest. And I have to say that I think one of the things that the sort of Me Too activism relates to the women's movement is the sort of idea about personal experience as being also political. A lot of that movement has relied on personal testimony of people talking about their own sexual assaults in order to show the ways in which sexual assault is a political problem, or problems of sexual aggression is a political problem shared by all women rather than a personal problem that one woman has experienced. And you can see that's sort of a mass consciousness raising that rather than happening in rec centers or in church basements is happening on Twitter. Right? That there's a way in which, Facebook is the nation's rec center now, right? Where people are sharing those kinds of ideas, and that there's a way, maybe not Facebook, because that's for the olds like me. I think the kids are using I think I just saw somebody back there rolling their eyes so hard they almost fell out of their chair. But certainly those kinds of movements are related to the kinds of ideas about the personal being political, right? But I think they also acknowledge that there's still work to be done, right? Here's a picture of all the women in Washington, D.C. after the inauguration. As Miss America protester, as Miss America protester Bev Grant puts it, quote, Jesus, it's 50 years and we're still fighting the same battles, right? We integrated the help wanted ads and we made some changes, but there's still a long way to go, unquote. So I'm going to leave it there.